This is the intro. Cue intro music.
It's time to hit the trail, lock in those hubs, and throw it into low range. Because you are listening to Wheelin' with Keith and Johnny Orange, broadcasting from the Thin Line Off-Road Studio. They're here to talk about 4x4s, trucks, and everything to do with enjoying the great outdoors. Buckle up. Here's your hosts, Keith and Johnny Orange.
So that's what we're going to be giving our folks this week, huh, John?
Yeah, I like it.
Tell you what, we got so many people to send us those awesome donations to do a commercial-free episode. Unfortunately,
cool.
The checks haven't cashed yet, so...
gotta wait another 10-day waiting period.
So, listeners, we're going to try something a little bit different this week, and we might even do it next week as well. We're going to go commercial-free for an episode, and we're going to blow through it. You can give us your feedback on 4x4 Talk on Facebook, but I'm going to give you a forewarning there. If we don't do commercials in our shows, the cost of doing the show becomes completely out of pocket. So we need you to sign up on patreon.com, the Wheelin' Show on there, WHEELIN', and become a subscriber there, and that's going to help us. If we could do all of our fundraising to keep the show going through Patreon, we wouldn't need commercials at all.
Indeed. And then we won't have to keep hitting up those Banks armored trucks on the side of the road anymore either.
Exactly. So continuing on, this is kind of a continuation episode as well from last week, right, John?
Yeah, a little bit of one, sort of the opposite of what we did.
Well, yeah, because we talked about the ultimate off-road axle in many people's minds, the Dana 60. I mean, granted, there's things that are
we're
cool.
talking the Spider Trax 9.
Well, those are pretty cool too.
If you
we
got
could
an
do
extra
it.
$60,000.
Yeah, I don't think they're that much, but we could do a 9-inch episode someday, and we should, because the 9-inch, I personally have a love and hate relationship with it. I mean, I love all of my 9 inches, but there's still times where there's issues. What's your problem over there?
Okay, 9 inches, whatever.
So, yeah.
Oh, shit.
So, yeah, it's that kind of episode, folks.
Oh, boy.
This is episode 61.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, all right. And last episode was episode 60. We talked about the Dana 60.
Now we're going to talk about the Dana 61.
We might as well
figuring these numbers out. Next week will be the Dana 62.
I'm not sure those exist.
I don't think so.
No, actually, next week.
63 though.
Next week is the FJ6 or the 60 Series Land Cruiser. Because we promised that a couple episodes back for our listeners.
I recall.
The Dana 61. You did your research. I already know what it is. There's a really interesting, I won't say history, but there's an interesting, what would it be called? A shift in the acceptance of that axle, maybe, or the shift in the public perception of that axle.
Oh, the one that we're going to talk about today?
Well, starting with the Dana 61.
Oh, yeah.
Because the idea today is to kind of talk about some of the worst axles ever made. And, kind of spoiler alert there for our listeners, this is the worst axle episode. And the Dana 61, to many, has gotten that reputation.
Yeah.
But there's a caveat to that. John, what do you got about the Dana 61 sitting over there?
Oh, well,
see if you're right, because I know a lot about them.
Obviously, it was a variation of the Dana 60, made to change up the gear ratios to allow for better fuel mileage. It's kind of the whole thing done in 73 with the whole oil crisis and all that going on back then.
Oh, they go back as far as 73?
Apparently.
Probably in a rear axle application only?
Yeah, I don't recall if it mentioned front or rear on it.
Okay, well, I can clarify that for you.
Oh, I forgot to separate some. Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead. I'm thinking out loud. Sorry.
Dana 61 was as far as I know, and if there's a listener out there, this is Keith, you're wrong, please correct me on 4x4 Talk on Facebook. But the Dana 61 only came with one gear ratio.
Yes.
And that's 307 gears. It is one of the lowest numerically gear ratios that was ever available in a Dana
There was
axle.
one other set available, a 331.
Okay, so 331s were
Yeah.
also in the 61 series.
Correct.
Memory
It just
says maybe
those are common.
they're not. I can tell you that they're not at all. But the 307 gear was the most common.
Yeah.
And it was a Dodge only axle for the most part, and it was used typically in the back of Dodge diesel trucks. Now, if it goes back to 73, then they must have also used it maybe in some 440 powered trucks or some 360 powered trucks.
It said it was in some Fords too.
Really?
Yeah.
So there you go. There's
on pickups and vans from 74 to 87.
well, then I'm probably going to stand corrected on the Dana 61 there.
Or I'm wrong. Could be either way.
Well, so the one that I was thinking of was the Dana 61 front axle,
Yeah.
and I believe that was Dodge only.
Yeah, Dodge 4x4 3/4 and 1 ton from 87 to 93.
There you go. That's
Yeah.
the one that has the love-hate relationship with the public. Mm-hmm. And you got any idea why?
Not offhand. I mean, it says it's very similar to the Dana 60 HD. But other than that, I mean, it doesn't really get into too
Externally,
many
the
details.
Dana 61 in the Dodges looks like a standard passenger drop Kingpin Dana 60 that
Nice.
you would find in a Dodge or a Chevy of that era. Like we talked in the last episode, in the late 80s, early 90s, the Chevy and Dodge axle was physically basically identical. Very minor differences, you know. The Dana 61 was in these diesel-powered trucks, also paired to a Dana 71 rear axle, which also had a
Interesting.
307 gear. But here's the deal. You take one out, you throw it in a junkyard pile somewhere. Mm-hmm. Even the most cautious of axle pickers at a junkyard
Yeah.
would look at it and think automatically that they've got a passenger drop Dana 60 sitting there. They would
Gotcha.
grab it, throw it in the truck. Here's the problem. You can't re-gear it.
Oh.
Now, there's ways with some creative machining and some spacers and other things to make other gear ratios fit,
Yeah.
but essentially that axle is meant only for the 307 gears and the 331s possibly that you're talking about. I don't know about a front application, but
Yeah.
so what happens is back in the I got into four-wheeling heaviest, I'd say, in the late 90s myself. As you know, we've talked about on the show before. And at that time, a number of these from wrecked, and they were only like at that time 8-9 years old trucks,
Yeah.
wrecked or maybe rusted out, you know, early driven a lot trucks were starting to hit the market, and people thought they were Dana 60s, and people were buying them. They were selling them on forums because we didn't have Facebook back then.
Yeah.
People were selling them on forums as, hey, I got a pair of Dana axles, a 60 and a 70, you know, and they're selling them for, because the prices have actually stayed pretty steady over the years. Back then, $900 or $1,000 or whatever.
Yeah.
People buy them, get home, and they crack them open 307 gears, and they go to order gears, and the gears wouldn't fit, and they'd figure out that they had a Dana 61.
Oh, that would be a bad day.
So from
That
the
would
late,
be a really bad
it is
day.
from the late 90s up through, I would say, 08, 09. Those axles were pretty much hated by the off-road community because
I can understand
here's this
that.
axle that has Dana 60 axle shafts. It has the big carrier. It has the outers that are correct for a Dana 60. It's got all the beefy stuff, but you can't re-gear it. And it's got essentially a crappy gear ratio
Yeah.
because 307 gears, as soon as you put that on like a set of 40s or 37s, your engine won't even turn it.
Yeah.
It's terrible. So here's what I was talking about though. 08, 09, the public perception started to change because gas prices started to skyrocket.
Oh.
And guys that were building mostly vintage trucks that were using stock to only slightly taller tires, so maybe running up to about a 33, 34-inch tire, started looking for the Dana 61 and Dana 71 for the 307 gear ratio so they could clip down the road at 1700 RPM
Yeah.
and not be burning a ton of fuel.
Huh. Nice.
So the gear ratio, or the gas miser guys, all of a sudden, in these axles, I've seen them go from a point where I would say 12, 15 years ago, you could pick up a Dana 61 if you knew it was a Dana 61
Yeah.
all day long for $250 or $300 because the outers were the same as a Dana 60, and pretty much you were picking it up, you were pulling the outers off, throwing them on a different axle,
Yeah. Just using it for parts.
using it for parts.
Yeah.
Now they're up to Dana 60 prices,
Really?
and sometimes higher because they're getting pretty hard to find.
Wow.
Yeah. They didn't
That
make as
seems
many of them
crazy.
as they did Dana 60s.
See, that makes sense. I mean, I understand the whole supply-demand thing, but I never would have figured something like that would...
Yeah. So
mean-
inherently, it's not a lemon axle.
Yeah. Well,
It's-
it became not a lemon axle.
Yeah, it was. It's a misunderstood axle.
Yeah.
If you know going into it that you want a 307 gear ratio instead of a 410 or a 456 or a 513 or something like that, and you want that really numerically low gear ratio, then go ahead and
Scoop it up.
scoop
You
it up
can.
and run
Yeah.
it. You know, personally, I've thought about it before. A vintage 60s or 70s Dodge or Chevy, because a Ford with a passenger drop would be a little weird. A vintage Dodge or Chevy, you know, maybe 1960s, kind of the first of the full-size trucks.
Yeah.
Swap something like a 4-cylinder or even a 6BT Cummins in it, or even a mild gas V8
That would be sweet.
with a set of 307s and a set of what they call pizza cutter tires, you know, the tall, skinny tires.
Oh, I hate those things.
Well, they look right on the certain trucks, like with
Yeah.
some white painted
All right.
steel wheels with like some
Yeah.
34-inch TSLs,
All right.
like the
yeah.
old farmer truck.
Yeah, those are kind of cool.
And now you got something that gets maybe 25, 27 miles a gallon. You know,
All right. That's,
granted, you're not going to win a
that's
truck
intriguing.
pull.
No.
You're not going to win a truck pull, but for
No.
a daily driver, if you're not hauling
that's
heavy,
not bad. Yeah.
yeah, if you're not pulling a heavy trailer behind you, you're not doing something like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of a cool truck.
Yeah, that would be.
So
One day.
well,
One day.
Yeah, one day. So on our list, when I emailed you over or Facebook messaged you or something like that, we talked about some other axles
Yeah.
that were. So the Dana 61, like I said, not really a lemon, but there are some lemon axles that our 4x4 listeners, our wheeling listeners, you want to avoid at all costs. You
Yeah.
really don't want to involve with putting any money into these axles.
No. I think probably of the list of what we discussed.
You want to go best to worst or best, or how do you want to do it?
Well, this one I'm gonna. There's two here I didn't look up because I just have straight up questions for you that caught me off guard.
Okay.
So you know what? We'll jump into one of those.
Sure, ask me.
You said a deuce and a half axle is not good. How does that factor?
Okay, there's another one that lies in the Dana 6171 category.
Okay.
Deuce and a half axle only came with 1 gear ratio. Okay, once
I'm
again,
not overly familiar with those axles. I just know they're big, beefy,
it's like
heavy duty.
672 or something like that. They're really,
Yeah.
really deep gear ratios. There is also a different gear ratio set that's like in the 5s, but they're really rare. But the biggest problem with a deuce and a half axle, and I've had a number of them go through my business back when I had
Yeah.
the thin line
They're
off road.
Stupid heavy. I know that much.
They're stupid heavy.
Yeah.
The drive shaft goes in above the axle really high. It's a top loader axle. So whatever you're putting in either has to be jacked up really high or it's got to be custom built for the drive shaft clearance.
Yeah.
That's a disadvantage.
I suppose it makes sense.
They come from the factory with big, heavy drum brakes that only fit 20-inch wheels.
I thought there were disc brakes on those for some reason.
The
Maybe
deuce
I'm
and a half
mistaken.
axles are all drum brakes. They're hydraulic drum
Oh.
brakes. And they're really, really heavy. If you're building just a mud bogger, maybe run them.
Yeah.
You're building something you want to run on the street, and you want decent pinion brakes in most states are not legal, and that's the cheapest
know
way to put brakes on a deuce and a half.
Maybe that's why I thought that because that's all I've ever seen of those. Really.
Cheapest disc brake kit I've ever seen for a deuce and a half axle is somewhere in the $1,500 range.
Ooh, buddy.
So now you're buying an axle for $1,000 and you're putting another $1,500 just that. Now, here's my personal, and I know I'm going to probably get burned as an effigy on a stake somewhere for saying this, but they're not that strong.
Yeah.
And here's my reasoning behind this. If you pull a deuce and a half axle shaft out, as I've done multiple times, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's like 1.62 inches is the shaft size.
It seems unusually small for something that big.
It's only like a tenth of what it is it would be less than a quarter of an inch bigger than a Dana 60 or Dana 70 axle.
Huh.
The shear strength on and then they're a coarse spline axle.
Yeah.
The shear strength on them is actually worse than a Dana 60 or Dana 70.
Wow.
You can go to Overson Engineering, which is an awesome company, by the way, and you can get like 47 spline 2-inch axle shafts for deuce and a halves, but you're talking
big money on that.
So the reason I put the deuce and a half axle on that list was that so many people have the belief that you can just grab a set of deuce and a half axles because they're so heavy, because they're so massive, throw them in your rig, and you're going to have these perfect axles. That's not the case. You've got brake issues, you've got drive line issues, and now you've got axle shafts that are only marginally bigger than Dana 70 axle shafts.
That all makes perfect sense. I never would have thought of it in that manner. Like you said, I just hear deuce and a half, think big, heavy duty, beefy, chunky steel.
Personally, I think it should be 2.5 times bigger than a 1 ton.
That would make sense,
wouldn't it? But it doesn't. It's not. So that's my. And then the other problem with deuce and a half axles, they are not labeled as to what kind of axle joint they have. They use a Rizeppa joint. Are you familiar with those?
I've heard the name. I don't remember what it is.
They used a Burfield style joint, and they used a U joint.
Okay.
The Rizeppa style joint was essentially 2 forks that are scissoring, like a couple of ladies with comfortable shoes.
Okay.
And they what is your issue?
Just keep going.
Just keep going. Anyways, and they're incredibly strong in a straight line and in a straight line only. When you go to turn with a Rizeppa joint, the shear strength is like minimal.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems like it would be an incredibly
because all of a sudden, if you think about 2 forks like this,
you're putting torsional
and you go to turn. Well, no, you're like this. You're really strong because you got a lot of surface. As soon as you turn, you're at the ends of the forks.
Yeah, you're putting sharp angles on little material.
Exactly. So, the Rizeppa joint is a no-no. The Burfield style joint is not like a Toyota Burfield that is super beefy. It's kind of a lame Burfield. It's kind of like the 70s Dodge Power Wagon ones.
Yeah.
They're not very well built. The U-joint ones are decent, but once again, they're not much bigger than a Dana 60 U-joint.
Yeah. So it comes down to why bother when you could put in less money to make a Dana 60 better than that.
A guy brought up a point that I was talking to once, and I don't remember exactly who it was. I know we were doing a campfire argument of axles at a wheeling event. And he said, to properly build a deuce and a half axle, front or rear, to properly build one to be worth the effort, you could have bought 3 or 4 fully built Dana 60s or Dana 70s.
Jeez.
So
yeah, I'd rather do that.
Exactly. And you're lighter.
Yeah.
So
tremendously.
That was basically the point that was being made.
But
so
the pinion brake's cool. I like
pinion
that.
brake's neat. They look neat. Yeah. So that's the deuce and a half axle in a nutshell. And if anybody's interested in how you find out which joint you have, besides dismantling the entire axle, you have to usually cut. Sometimes you can unbolt and squeeze it back a little bit with the boot at the joint because they have a big rubber boot.
Gotcha.
Most people that have deuce and a half axles for sale are not willing to cut the boot.
Understandable.
But most people who have sold a number of deuce and a half axles know that the boots don't cost very much, and if you want to sell it, the people are going to want to know what's in there because a Rizeppa joint...
If they know what they're doing.
Yeah. A Rizeppa joint deuce and a half axle, you might get $600 for, where a U-joint deuce and a half axle, you might get twice that.
Wow.
So guys are like, well, I'm not giving you your $1,000, $1,200, $1,500 asking price unless I know it's a U-joint axle. So
I can understand that. I've had deals where it's like, look, I got to see this thing work before I'm paying that kind of money for it.
It's no different than buying, say, a race engine from somebody that swears that it's got a big cam, swears it's got forged pistons, and it swears it's got a balanced crank. Unless they show you paperwork with the serial number of that engine.
It's stock.
Assume it's stock, because no matter how much chrome they put on the outside of it.
Yeah, it doesn't change what happens inside.
Unless you take it apart. So you said you had another one. You want to go down?
Well, yeah, we'll knock this other one off the list. So we just did the entire episode on the Dana 60. We're talking about it here. But you had on the list the 94 to 02 Dodge Dana 60.
Yeah, we totally missed that in the last episode. The reason with the problem with that Dana 60 is, one, it's a unit bearing axle.
Okay.
So they don't have rebuild
unit bearings.
Unit bearings in the Super Duties are pretty good, but the Dodge unit bearings actually, there's this weird dance you have to do with the like the rotors are pressed on. The unit bearings are only about 1.25 inches wide on it.
Huh.
So they don't like much more than about a 35-inch tire.
Yeah, that's a pretty trash bearing.
Very trash bearing. Side note on that, though, there is a very easy junkyard upgrade using IFS F250 stuff to make it the same as an old rebuildable Dana 60.
Nice.
You can do that on the Dodges. So that's its
Nice.
only saving grace.
Yeah.
You can actually pop the Ford spindle in there, re-drill the holes, put the Ford hub, Ford brakes, everything on there.
Nice.
You get a better axle.
Very nice. Very nice.
But they were a vacuum disconnect axle.
Oh.
Except for the very last year, kind of like what Jeep did with the YJ. The very last year, some of them didn't have vacuum disconnect.
Yeah.
But the Dodges, through most of the run, they had a vacuum disconnect. They were only 30 spline inners instead of 35 spline inners.
Bummer.
Low pinion.
Yeah.
They were the worst of everything a Dana 60 ever offered.
Yeah. That sucks.
Small U-joints.
Yep.
Yeah, just not a good axle.
Yeah, that's disappointing.
Junkyard value of those is about $75. So anyone that tries to sell you one off a marketplace or anything for $400, $500, $600,
They're
that is
smoking
not
something.
it's not a deal.
Yeah.
I've seen guys do it. I know a guy that bought one for his XJ, and he wheels it because he bought it, and he's like, "Man, I spent all this money on it. I have to use it now." He went and spent $400, $500, $600 in this thing, thinking he was getting a deal.
Yeah.
And he has been slapping money into this thing for the last
Jeez.
8 years.
It's an XJ's hurting that though. They weigh like
He's like an
nothing.
XJ on like 39-inch IROCs.
Oh, all right, that's different. that's your more.
I
than
think
your
he even
standard
LS
run-of-the-mill
swapped
XJ.
it recently.
Yeah, that's a lot more than your run of the mill XJ.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, just avoid those Dodge
Yeah,
axles.
yeah.
Any Dodge axle with a unit bearing, including the old Dana 44s from back in the 70s, they ran for a couple of years. Just avoid. If you're
Yeah.
buying a Dodge solid axle for anything. Even the AAM axles they make now, which are really strong, use a bunch of special tools to work
Yeah.
on them, and it really sucks. So pretty much only buy rebuildable bearing Dodge front axles, period.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I always like serviceability of any of that stuff
Exactly.
anyways.
Exactly.
Contrary to I'm still running stock axles on mine, but that's a budget thing. So
Yeah.
well, I think we can do a short note on this one. The ZJ Dana 44.
Well, you know the problems of that one.
It's aluminum.
Well, not only is it aluminum, it's aluminum which aluminum's not inherently bad, but it's aluminum with steel tubes pressed into it.
Yeah, and it's a C-clip type axle. Doesn't use a lot of the standard Dana 44 components.
Yep.
The interesting thing, it's internally similar to the one in the Viper, though.
Yeah.
And there's one. I'll give it one. Play devil's advocate here. There's one great thing about that ZJ Dana 44 for any Jeep person out there.
You can scrap it and get like $20.
No.
Oh.
You can steal its disc brakes, put them on 35s or other Dana 44s.
True enough. Yeah.
That's about all they're good for.
Beyond, like John said, them being weak, they are notoriously famous for bending
Yes.
or cracking at the housing.
Yes.
They are notoriously famous for twisting the tubes at the housing.
too. Yep.
And they are notoriously famous for leaking, which usually is because of the cracked housings
Yeah,
and things
or
like that.
tweaked.
So just they weren't strong enough. Now, you could put a truss on a Dana 44 aluminum, and
At
it
that
would.
point, you're going to put that kind of money into it. You might as well get a good
yeah,
one.
like you said, there's still nothing available
Yeah,
for it. You might be able to
yeah.
get a lock rate for it, but that's about it.
yeah.
You're not going to put like an ARB in it. You're not
No.
going to. Yeah, it's
Your
just
options, you're better off spending the money and the time on a good one.
Yep.
And go from there.
pretty much. So if you got a ZJ and you want to swap something in that is going to be really close to a stock axle, swap a Ford 8.8 out of an Explorer in it.
Yeah, they make those kits. They're like, what, $250? So that the bracket kit?
Real cheap. Yeah, it
Yeah.
might even be less than that. And the axle's only, I think, 1.25 inches. 5/8 narrower.
It was either, it might be 5/8 on each side.
Yeah. So
I think it's 5/8 on each side.
Yeah, so it's like a little over 1 inch
Yeah.
narrower. You probably won't have to put wheel spacers on it. You might.
Nah. Depends
but-
on your wheels.
But your bolt patterns are the same and
yeah,
everything.
The nice thing there, like you said, you can pull those out. I think the one I have, I got $200, 410 gears, limited slip, big splines, and disc brakes.
There you go, man.
And they make a super. It is a C-clip, but they make a C-clip eliminator and like Super 88 kit with the chromoly shafts. It's only a couple $100. Gets rid of that and it spaces it right back out to a stock spacing.
You're talking about the 8.8, not the aluminum
correct.
44.
Yeah, the 8.8. Yeah,
the Ford
trash the
8.8.
Ford 4.
Yep.
Go with that. They're stout axles. They're phenomenal axles. requires special fluid, which kind of
Trash
sucks,
the Dana 44. You
Yes.
said Ford 4.
I meant the 44.
Yeah, trash the Dana 44.
The people knew what I meant.
Put a Ford 8.8
yes,
in it.
yes, exactly.
Gotcha.
No, they're great axles. They're awesome.
You had anything else on that list? And we'll.
I got one big one here, and we touched on it a little bit. The Dana 30, the early Dana 30.
Early Dana 30. Now, we're not talking the CJ Dana 30. We are talking the XJ and
The
YJ
YJ.
Dana
Yeah.
30, 1984 to 1994.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Because
sorry.
1995 was
It
non-vac.
was 95 was a split year.
Yeah, well, half the year they had non-vacuum
Yes.
disconnect. So
Yeah.
call it early
Actually,
95.
the vacuum disconnect stopped in 92.
In the YJ? No, in the XJ.
I believe it was, yeah.
And so the XJ ones, the vacuum disconnect Dana 30.
Those were problematic.
Yeah.
That's what Project XJ originally had. And yeah, it needed gaskets on the little housing every winter. It'd get water in it, it would freeze up, and then you couldn't get in the 4x4.
So listeners out there, I know we have, most of you know what we're talking about, but if we got a listener out there that is kind of a newbie to the industry and you're not sure what we're talking about, this vacuum disconnect thing, if you look at a solid axle, which is an axle that goes in one point from the front wheel or from one wheel to the other in a straight line, it's solid axle. Google it if you don't know what a solid axle is, you'll figure it out. But a number of manufacturers, mainly Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, has, as a fuel mileage thing, put a vacuum disconnect in the longest side of the axle to disconnect the axle shaft,
Physically
disconnect it with a vacuum module. And this supposedly returned like 0.2 miles a gallon better or something like that.
Yeah.
The problem is with rust, salt, age, things like that, that vacuum stops working. Plus, it's a weak point when you're
Yeah,
off-roading.
more failure point potential.
You're not, instead of having 2 front axle shafts, you have 3.
Yeah, and then
Inners.
if assuming you keep the stock setup, if you snag a line, rip the fitting off, or crack the hose, then you lose it.
Easiest way to tell this on any axles, if you look at the differential, the big chunk, the pumpkin they call it, if you look at that, then the longest side of the axle tube, if it goes in a straight line to the point where your brakes and everything are mounted, then that's a non-vacuum disconnect axle. If there's in the middle of it, a big kind of cast iron chunk of stuff with a line going to it, you got a vacuum disconnect axle.
And they do make kits to eliminate that.
They do.
There's some, it's a cover plate and a solid axle shaft. Or I think Oxlocker makes a kit that actually gives you a cable shifter instead of the vacuum. So there are options if you're stuck with it. You know, if you got a budget, you can't get something better. You have options.
Personally, I guess our point, and John, I don't know if you agree with me or not. Personally, my point is if you've got a vacuum disconnect axle,
swap it.
Well, before that, run it as it is, but don't put any money into it.
Yeah, that's probably a better
Don't
way
go
to
putting
say it.
gears and lockers and all this stuff into a vacuum disconnect axle.
No.
Save that money to buy a junkyard non-vacuum disconnect.
Yeah.
Because that's a nice thing. All the vehicles that ever used a vacuum disconnect axle, at least in the U.S., they also had a version in the same vehicles that was non-vacuum disconnect.
Yeah, point case again, Project XJ. I actually swapped in out of a 98 XJ, a high pinion, no vacuum disconnect axle, and it bolts right in. I get the newer brakes,
Direct
bigger
bolt in.
U-joints, bigger ball joints, all that good stuff.
Same thing, even the Dodge guys, if you have a disconnect Dana 60 Dodge in a 25 or 3500 94 to 02, if you get one of those like last end of 02, early 03 axles that didn't have the vacuum disconnect, those are really, really rare, but you can find them. Those will swap in, but you can also go to the AAM axle, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it is a big upgrade.
I don't know a lot about them.
They're 34 spline. They use special tools, special brakes. But they're very strong.
Already.
They're very strong axle.
Yeah.
But if you get an AAM axle, it will bolt into a 94 to 02 Dodge. Physically bolts in. The only thing that doesn't work is the not the sway bar, the locating bar. What is that one called? The
track bar?
The track bar.
Yeah.
The track bar will not fit. You can cut and weld yours, or one from a Jeep JK bolts in directly.
Ha!
So
Nice.
if you're doing a 94 to 02 and you're putting an AAM axle in, all you need to do is get a Jeep JK Wrangler track bar, bolt it in. Boom, now it bolts in. You don't have to mess with anything.
I like that.
You've upgraded. You haven't gone to like the good Dana 60s or anything like that, but you've like
get a little
doubled your
closer.
strength of what you had.
Nice.
So.
Nice.
But, I know we had a couple. I know we're trying to get to the end of this one. We had a couple honorable mentions. I mentioned Suzuki Samurais. All in all, they're actually a pretty stout little axle.
Yeah.
But don't make the mistake of buying Samurai axles to swap into some other lightweight rig. Guys have bought them in the past to swap into old Willys or something like that because they have disc brakes in the front and this and that.
Yeah.
They're fine in a Samurai. You can make them plenty strong in a Samurai. You put them in anything that weighs over 2,000 pounds, you're going to snap axle shafts like pretzels at a
pretzel sounds good.
Yeah, I'll say pretzels at a Super Bowl party.
Nice.
They're not meant. They're meant for like 31s, 33s, if you will, kind of lightly.
Yeah.
After that, they're not that great. And then I mentioned Rover axles. The only problem that is really with Rover axles in the U.S. is once again special tools.
Yeah.
And kind of like a Land Cruiser axle, they're bathed in grease and stuff like that, but they use really tiny axle shafts compared to a Land Cruiser. Land Cruiser uses like a 2-ton truck size axle shafts. The Land Rover,
I remember talking about that
the
before,
Land Rovers use these piddly little things. So the same thing. Don't play with Land Rover axles unless you're in a Land Rover and then you want to buy upgraded
desperate.
stuff for them. Yeah. Well, that's about it, man. Did you have anything else on axles? You got any other ones out there you don't want to talk about or anything?
Not that I could think
you
of
wanna
off the
talk
top
about?
of my head. I thought I had one earlier and I forgot to write it down.
Well, we
Can't
mentioned the
remember what
Dana
it was,
50 in the last episode.
Briefly we did, yeah.
Stay away from those. The Ford
Yeah.
Dana 50. I'm not going to get in the whole thing. If you want to hear about those, listen to episode 60.
Yeah.
They were kind of a same as a 61. They were a 60 in sheep's clothing, basically.
Yeah.
Or wolf's clothing, whatever.
Uh,
But so there you go, man. Kind of a shorter episode, but if folks, if you're looking for those axles not to buy, this is pretty much them. Tell you what, I'm going to let you do your sign off. Before you do that,
Okay.
I want to say one more time, go to Facebook and join 4x4 Talk. If there's another axle out there in some vehicle that we didn't really talk about, and we're not talking about IFS. Don't swap IFS into anything.
Oh, God, no. No. If you do, unfriend us, remove yourself from 4x4 Talk, and go about your merry way.
Delete Facebook from your phone. Throw your phone in the ocean.
Yes.
For an exit speech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, just with the if there's an axle out there that you say, man, you guys forgot about this one, it's a piece of crap, tell us about it.
Yeah.
On that note, John, what else did you tell them about?
Well, I mean, you pretty much hit the nose as far as 4x4 Talk, but if you guys don't know how to get there, just go on Facebook, type 4x4 Talk. A couple quick questions get you on the page, and ask away. It's where we post some of our project updates and stuff like that. If you are wanting to get some excuse me,
Some X.
access,
You're selling X now?
no, different phone number, phone number. If you would like access to some of our bonus content, bonus show, be sure to check us out. Patreon.com/WheelinRadio. Lowest $2 a month gets you access to the End of the Trail, which is the after show that immediately follows this. A lot of cool, fun stuff there. We have a lot of fun with that. Of course, huge thank you to Mr. Andrew, our producer. Thank you for all that you do, sir. Without you, none of this would be possible. And then I think that's about it. I don't know, were we still going to be doing the YouTube thing? We never actually discussed that.
We'll discuss it more. We do have a few followers on YouTube, but
Yeah, in the meantime, if you are checking us out on YouTube, or listening at least, make sure to hit like and subscribe so that you see future content from us. With that being said, thanks for listening, and have a good one, everybody.